Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague expected air harassment, not a battleship duel. He was wrong. At 0645 hours on the 25th of October 1944, muzzle flashes from Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force appeared off Samar, less than 20 nautical miles away. Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3 inches had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their biggest carrier guns were 5-inch, 38 caliber. Kurita's line included the battleship Yamato with 18.1-inch main guns, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. Sprague's ships were built for close air support over Leyte, not for absorbing armor-piercing shells. They lacked guns able to penetrate battleship belt armor at long range. Their defensive tools were torpedoes, smoke generators, rain squalls, and continuous aircraft attacks with 500-pound bombs and depth charges. The first Japanese salvos arrived quickly. Shell splashes began walking toward the escort carriers as they turned east at maximum speed, about 17 knots, launching aircraft as fast as flight decks allowed. Radio circuits filled with conflicting reports because multiple Japanese columns were firing through haze. One factor disrupted Kurita's advantage. Aggressive destroyer attacks at torpedo range forced repeated course changes. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, moved ahead of the screen and increased speed to about 34 knots. Evans did not have armor to trade with heavy cruisers. Johnston displaced about 2,100 tons and carried 5 5-inch, 38 guns and 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. Yet at roughly 0700 hours, she began a charge that would delay Kurita's gunnery and buy minutes Taffy 3 could use. The 25th of October 1944, 0645 hours. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague turned Task Unit 77.4.3 east off Samar Island, roughly 60 nautical miles northeast of Leyte, after lookouts reported Japanese masts and gun flashes to the west. Sprague had ordered his escort carriers to provide close air support and anti-submarine patrols over the Leyte beachhead. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, with aircraft already armed for ground attack. On the opposing side, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force emerging from San Bernardino Strait. It included the battleship Yamato and multiple heavy cruisers and destroyers. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns could reach beyond 35,000 yards with armor-piercing shells. Taffy 3 expected only scattered air attack and submarines because U.S. command believed Kurita had been turned back during actions in the Sibuyan Sea. Escort carriers relied on 5-inch, 38 guns and 40mm Bofors mounts for defense. Against heavy cruiser armor and battleship belts, these weapons had limited penetration at typical engagement ranges. But geography and timing created different conditions. The center force was close. The first salvos came within minutes, and rain squalls reduced visibility to roughly 5,000 to 10,000 yards in patches. This meant Kurita's fire control would be disrupted, but it also limited Sprague's ability to identify targets. Intelligence gathered from contact reports late on the 24th of October indicated Japanese surface forces were split and under air attack. However, this did not account for Kurita's overnight transit and the failure to screen San Bernardino Strait with surface forces. The local weather added a tactical variable. Wind over the deck, about 15 to 20 knots from the east, helped escort carriers launch aircraft, but low cloud layers forced pilots to climb through gaps and reduced spotting for naval gunfire. What happened in the next 90 minutes would determine whether Taffy 3 could keep its carriers afloat and keep Leyte's invasion area supplied. At 0647 hours, the first Japanese salvos straddled the rear escort carrier line. At 0650, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered, "Make smoke," and turned south and east at best speed, about 17 knots for the escort carriers. At 0655 hours, Destroyer Squadron Screen Commander Captain Thomas E. Fraser in USS Hull began laying smoke with fuel oil injectors while firing 5-inch, 38 batteries at extreme range. At 0700 hours, Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans in USS Johnston increased to about 34 knots and steered toward the nearest cruiser column. At 0702 hours, Johnston opened fire with 5-inch, 38 guns using Mk-37 director control while closing to torpedo range. Her 10 21-inch torpedoes used Mark 15 warheads of roughly 825 pounds of explosive. At 0706 hours, Evans launched a spread from about 10,000 yards, forcing at least one heavy cruiser to turn away and disrupting formation. At 0710 hours, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered maneuvers to avoid torpedoes, and Japanese gunnery temporarily shifted from the escort carriers to the attacking destroyers. At 0715 hours, U.S. aircraft from CVE decks began attacks with 500-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and even depth charges when armor-piercing bombs were unavailable. At 0720 hours, Japanese cruiser fire bracketed Johnston. Splashes rose within tens of yards as 8-inch and 14-inch shells landed through the smoke boundary. At 0725 hours, Sprague's staff reported escort carriers separating in squalls with visibility varying from 1 to 3 nautical miles. At 0730 hours, Kurita received fragmentary reports of torpedo hits and air attacks and could not confirm the U.S. carrier type. Misidentification mattered. He believed he was engaging fleet carriers and fast escorts rather than jeep carriers and destroyer escorts. But at 0735 hours, with smoke thinning and ranges closing again, Yamato's main battery resumed firing that would prove decisive. At 0736 hours, Lieutenant, junior grade, Horace D. Hod Hicks, radar officer aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, CVE-70, watched the SK air search scope show dense surface returns at 17,800 yards, bearing 270. Almost simultaneously, the forward lookout reported 2 red-orange waterline flashes through thinning smoke, consistent with battleship muzzle blast. By 0737 hours, Hicks' plot confirmed the contacts were closing at roughly 30 knots, far faster than the 17-knot escort carriers. This contradicted earlier assumptions of scattered cruisers. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague was told the nearest column included at least one battleship, not only heavy cruisers. At 0738 hours, Sprague directed the carrier line to continue east while ordering Captain Thomas E. Fraser to press a torpedo attack with USS Hull and USS Heermann. He also broadcast, "Small Boys Attack," on TBS. 2 minutes later, 3 CVE decks launched 16 aircraft under fire. The decisive technical cause was Japanese optical fire control coupled to Yamato's Type 98 15-meter rangefinder and main battery of 46 centimeters, 45 guns. At 20,000 yards, the Type 91 armor-piercing shell still retained battle-effective velocity, while US 5-inch, 38 projectiles could not penetrate cruiser belts beyond roughly 10,000 yards. Strategically, this mattered because Taffy 3's survival depended on forcing repeated Japanese course changes, breaking fire control solutions. U.S. commanders expected Kurita to be delayed after the Sibuyan Sea, where he had lost 3 heavy cruisers. Off Samar, he arrived with 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. Evidence appears in USS Fanshawe Bay Action Report, the 25th of October 1944, noting surface targets closing rapidly, and salvos resembling battleship fire. Post-war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Naval Analysis Unit cited Kurita's 0730 estimate that he faced fleet carriers, explaining why he pursued aggressively despite air attack. The attack orders took effect by 0745 hours. USS Hull, USS Heermann, and USS Johnston each ran in through smoke at 28 to 34 knots, drawing cruiser fire away from the carriers for measurable intervals. During Hull's first run, Japanese gunnery on the CVEs slackened for approximately 6 minutes, and ranges opened from about 18,000 to 22,000 yards as Kurita's van turned to comb torpedo tracks. At 0748 hours, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered escort carriers to commenced making maximum speed and zigzag, changing from a steady easterly retirement to irregular legs. Vice Admiral Kurita responded at 0750 with a general signal to concentrate on carriers ahead, overriding earlier individual ship maneuvers. That shift required Japanese destroyers to lay smoke and reform screening stations at roughly 4,000-yard intervals. By 0810 hours, Taffy 3 had launched 42 additional sorties, many armed only with 500-pound bombs or depth charges, sustaining attacks every 3 to 5 minutes. Losses were severe. USS Hull was effectively wrecked by multiple 8-inch hits, and USS Johnston suffered progressive flooding after at least 3 heavy-caliber impacts. Post-war 7th Fleet analysis estimated the destroyer attacks delayed Kurita's effective carrier target fire by about 20 minutes. The full implications would only be understood when classified files were opened decades later. Documents recovered in 1997 revealed Kurita's flagship Yamato logged a critical ammunition constraint that morning. The main battery began the action with a mixed allowance of Type 91 armor-piercing and Type 3 incendiary beehive shells, and gunnery officers quickly shifted to Type 3 for perceived aircraft threats. The entry appears in the Combined Fleet Operations Diary and Yamato's action notes held at Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies. This contradicts the tidy version of battleships simply overpowering carriers. Some of Yamato's longest salvos were optimized for airburst fragmentation, reducing armor-piercing lethality at key moments. Medical and damage control records showed Taffy 3's screen was thinner than official strength tables suggest. Destroyer escorts were assigned 4 ships, yet the task unit war diary lists only 3 with full anti-submarine loadouts. 1 carried reduced depth charges after earlier patrols. Sick bay logs on Fanshawe Bay and Heerman record 73 heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation cases by 0900, reducing manning at repair lockers and gun mounts. Compared to nominal complements, effective topside and damage control strength fell about 12% during the fight. That attrition limited sustained smoke generation and slowed ammunition supply, shaping how long destroyers could maintain high-rate 5-inch fire. For decades, it was believed Kurita's retreat was a sudden loss of nerve after air attack and destroyer torpedoes. However, declassified files in 1980, including portions of the U.S. Navy's post-action interrogations and Japanese operational signals, showed a more structured collapse in command information. Morrison's 1958 account emphasized tactical heroism. Hornfisher's 2004 synthesis, using newly cataloged Japanese diaries, stressed misidentification and shattered formation control under smoke and squalls. Evidence and debate now center on comparisons with the earlier Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, where 2 forces broke off after hours of long-range gunnery despite inferior firepower on one side. Off Samar, Kurita's 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers faced 6 CVEs and 7 small combatants, yet air and torpedo threats produced repeated turns that erased range advantages. The consensus, supported by records at the U.S. National Archives and Freiburg's Bundesarchiv Naval Studies, is that information friction, not simple fear, drove the decision. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, USS Johnston's commanding officer, was 35, leading Destroyer Squadron 47's forward ship. At 0700 he chose to leave the smokescreen and charge the cruiser line, accepting that his 2,100-ton destroyer would be bracketed by 8-inch fire. In his after-action remarks recorded by survivors, Evans repeated an order logged at the 25th of October 1944. "A large Japanese fleet is closing. We will make a torpedo attack." Johnston's first spread forced at least 1 heavy cruiser to sheer away, buying roughly 10 minutes before concentrated fire returned to the carriers. By 0945 remembered time, Johnston had taken multiple heavy-caliber hits, lost speed, and was abandoned. 141 of about 327 were rescued. Evans was last seen on deck directing evacuation and was killed. His Navy Cross citation and survivor statements are preserved at the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. His experience was typical of the 1,500 men who faced this dilemma, influencing later doctrine. By 0930 on the 25th of October 1944, Kurita's center force had reversed course, ending the surface threat to Leyte Gulf's transport anchorage. That decision compressed 7th Fleet's emergency timeline. Instead of diverting Admiral Kinkaid's reserve battleships eastward, only 3 destroyers and 6 FM-2 CVE strike packages were retasked from beach support to pursuit. 7th Fleet staff projected the loss of 4 to 6 CVEs and 2 ammunition ships. Actual losses were 2 CVEs, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, about 55% fewer ships than forecast. Months later, the fight forced a doctrinal shift toward layered, small ship, defense of carriers. By the 15th of February 1945, Pacific Fleet directives emphasized smoke, torpedo salvo coordination, and continuous light carrier air harassment against surface raiders. Operations planned for the 26th of October 1944. Kurita's bombardment of Leyte shipping lanes occurred on the 25th of October for 90 minutes, then ceased. That one-day pullback preserved an estimated 20,000 tons of daily supply flow to 6th Army through November. Historian Jonathan Parshall calculates that if the destroyer torpedo attacks and improvised airstrikes off Samar had not occurred, Kurita could have reached the Leyte transport area by midday, delaying MacArthur's consolidation by 10 to 14 days through destroyed fuel and ammunition stocks. Most scholars now treat the action as tactically defensive but strategically decisive. It removed the last credible chance for a Japanese surface fleet to break the invasion's logistics. Measured against Surigao Strait, where 6 U.S. battleships annihilated a force of 2 battleships, Samar inverted the metric. Roughly 7 small combatants held off 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers long enough to force withdrawal. Clifton A.F. Sprague returned to Coronado in 1945 and remained in the Navy, later commanding Carrier Division 3 during early Cold War deployments. In a 1968 oral history, he said, dated the 12th of June, "We fought with what we had on deck, not what we wished we had." Sprague retired as a Vice Admiral and died in San Diego on the 11th of December 1992. He is buried at Fort Rosecrans. Ernest E. Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, and many of Johnston's survivors rebuilt lives in Oklahoma and Texas. A permanent memorial, the USS Samuel B. Roberts and Taffy 3 display, was dedicated on the 25th of October 1994 at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. In 2017, the U.S. Navy formalized surface action, distributed lethality, training that explicitly rehearses smoke, decoys, and coordinated torpedo-style attacks by smaller ships against heavier combatants. On the 25th of October 1944, 2,900 men achieved Kurita's withdrawal, shifting the Leyte campaign trajectory by 1 critical day of uninterrupted unloading.